All right. Our final little lesson for this module for this week is dealing with September 11th. Friday is September the 11th. And I thought we need to pause on that day and talk about what happened on that day and also put it in the bigger picture of terrorism in the United States. Okay. So we're going to talk about terrorism as a whole, focusing on September 11th. We're going to use the acronym SCARE. Each one of those letters is going to stand for an event or a tactic used in terrorism. We're also going to talk about some major causes of terrorism and our government's response, which we're going to use the acronym SIRS to talk about our government response. Okay. Now, there is no worksheet or anything like that you need to fill out for this. I would use your own paper and kind of set it up like this. There's the acronym SCARE. Then question number one down there at the bottom, or number one down there at the bottom, is going to deal with the major causes. And then number two is going to deal with the government response. Okay. And this will help you with a little homework assignment this week dealing with September 11th. Okay. So before we get into the specific events, let's talk about a major cause of terrorism. In recent years, now this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but in recent years, the major cause of terrorism has been religious extremism. Okay, especially in terms of September 11th, it was religious extremism. Okay, poverty was once thought to play a role. Okay, however, modern terrorists are often wealthy. In fact, they are able to fund their own terrorist groups and their own terrorist training camps, and they're able to fund weapons and technology and stuff like that for their groups to use. Okay, so we're moving away from poverty and wealth, but religious extremism, you guys know, was September 11th, and we'll talk about it here in just a second. Those that were involved were representing the Muslim religion, but again, it is important not to judge an entire religion by a specific group because these Muslims, I don't think, represent all Muslims, okay? But they had decided that they were tired of the West and they were tired of Western domination, and that's why they attacked the United States, okay? So we're going to look at some major events here. Of course, the S in SCARE does stand for the September 11th attacks, which were masterminded by Osama bin Laden, okay? Now, I was in college when the September 11th attacks occurred at the World Trade Center in New York, of course, the down plane in Pennsylvania, and then the Pentagon, which is in Virginia. Okay, it is not in Washington, D.C., it's in Virginia. But I was in college. It was a very, very weird situation that day. The college actually canceled classes. And I went to Roanoke College, and Roanoke College never cancels classes. And they actually canceled classes that day. Of course, we had several students from New York, so they were trying to get in touch with families and things like that. But it was very, very weird because they actually canceled class that day. I was actually at work that morning. I was going to class in the afternoon. I was actually at work that morning. And I will admit, I did not believe it was a terrorist attack to begin with. I thought it was a pilot error because if you've ever flown into New York, if you've flown out of New York, you know New York is very, very landlocked. And it hadn't been that long before the September 11 attacks that a plane actually kind of ran off the runway and into one of the rivers around New York. So when I heard about these planes hitting these buildings, I just assumed it was a pilot error, that there was an inexperienced pilot trying to come into New York, trying to land in New York, and they had misshot and hit the towers. Okay. Of course, then another report came that they hit another tower, and then came the report of the Pentagon and the report of the downplane in Pennsylvania. So then it became apparent that something was going on. Okay, Osama bin Laden, and do not worry about writing all this stuff down. Just write down the bold faced stuff at the top. Osama bin Laden formed the terrorist organization Al Qaeda in the early 1990s. Its goal was to attack U.S. targets The World Trade Center was an early target. In fact, the World Trade Center had been hit before September 11th. And by the way, it's September 11th, 2001. Al Qaeda was based in Afghanistan when the September 11 attacks took place. The U.S. invaded in October of 2001. And of course, the war has been going on now for almost 20 years. Our presence in that part of the world has now been there for about 20 years. Okay. Here's a timeline of Al Qaeda attacks against U.S. targets in 1993. That was when the first attack at the World Trade Center occurred. It was a bombing that occurred in the basement of the building. It was actually in the parking garage of the building. 6 were killed and 1,042 were injured. Then you had the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, where 19 U.S. airmen were killed, and that was in 96. In 98, you had U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya bombed. 224 were killed and 4,000 were injured. 2000, you had the USS Cole, which was in port in Yemen. 17 were killed and 39 were injured. And I believe Mrs. Carter, one of her family members, was involved with the USS Cole, I think with the cleanup of the USS Cole. And then the September 11 attacks in 2001, which killed 2,992. Okay. And again, I think that estimate is going up because of the effects of the attack, the health effects. There are people dying from poisons and things like that. That number is probably going up in terms of who was affected by those September 11 attacks. The C in SCARE stands for car bombings. Okay, 1993, the World Trade Center was struck by Al Qaeda for the first time with a car bomb. It occurred down, like I said, in the basement, in the parking garage under the basement. Okay, under the building. 6 died and 1,042 were injured. I think the scary thing about that was it occurred in the basement, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, on the first floor of the World Trade Center, that's where the nursery was, okay, for the employees with children. That's where they could take their kids while they were at work and things like that. So when you're getting that close to the first floor, it is a very, very scary situation because that's where the kids are. Okay. Now, keep in mind, I also want to say as we move forward here, Al Qaeda is not the only one to use these tactics. Other groups have used car bombings as well in other parts of the world. In fact, Timothy McVeigh, if you know about the Oklahoma City bombings in Oklahoma City, of course, he's not connected to Al Qaeda, but he used a car bomb. He used a car bomb there as well. So other terrorist groups are using this tactic, okay? And what is so scary about this, and why we talk about this, is because this is what's dangerous. We are using everyday common objects like a car to inflict harm and pain, okay? And that's what's scary about all of this, all right? 1993, the World Trade Center was struck by Al Qaeda for the first time. Car bomb, 6 died, 1,042 were injured. Airline hijackings. Airline hijackings date back to the 1960s and have often involved Islamic extremists. September 11th, it was the first time the planes were used as weapons by terrorists. Usually, in the case where you are using planes or when terrorists hijack planes, the planes themselves, they down the planes themselves. Okay, you never saw the planes being used as weapons against another civilian center. That's why those attacks were so brutal. Okay, and of course there you see a picture from Pennsylvania where the plane was downed. We have a feeling it was on its way to Washington, probably either the White House or the Capitol building. All right, and those are the 4 hijackers of that flight that was down in Pennsylvania. The raid at the Munich Olympics. Again, terrorist attacks are not new. In 1972, the Olympics were held in Munich, West Germany. Islamic terrorists opposed to Israel took the entire Jewish Olympic team hostage, killing 11 athletes. It was a very, very sad situation. There was a rescue attempt that was made, and that's when the team ended up getting killed, along with some of the rescuers. The Germans eventually released the terrorists, and they were caught and they were put on trial, but they were eventually released. Golda Meir, who was prime minister of Israel, basically arranged for an assassination task force to hunt them down and kill them. There is a great movie out there by Steven Spielberg called Munich that deals with the retaliation for the killing of the Israeli athletes at this Munich Olympics. And the picture there that you see is one of the kidnappers um, trying to negotiate with some people on the ground before the failed rescue attempt. Okay. Um, so as bad as September 11th is, it is sadly not the first terrorist attack that we've seen in history. And then last but not least, the extreme use of suicide bombings. In 2000, Al Qaeda suicide bombers blew up a small boat next to the USS Cole, but that explosion impacted the Cole. 17 U.S. sailors were killed and 39 were injured. Okay, so the little boat was blown up, but it was close to the USS Cole. Okay, and again, that's why I think we are focusing on September 11th is because of the extreme use of terrorism. Like I said, terrorist attacks have occurred before. You had the Munich Olympics. You had the airline hijacked over Lockerbie, Scotland in the 70s, I think. Even Pearl Harbor could be considered a terrorist attack, okay? Because it was unprovoked. But this extreme use, using things like car bombs, using things like airplanes as weapons, bombing up boats beside bigger battleships, attacking civilian centers, all of this has represented a change in terrorism. And why we take time to study it and why we take time like on September 11th to remember what happened. Because it is impacting our world still today. Now, what has been our response? Our governmental response is very, very controversial. Okay, we are trying to prevent terrorist attacks in the future through things like surveillance, increased surveillance. You guys see that at school. That's why we have cameras at the school. That's why we have blue lights at the school in case there's a crisis situation. Those blue lights go off. ID badges. To help get into schools, okay, to help get into airports. I mean, that's something that I've seen since since I've started teaching. When I started teaching, we didn't have to have ID badges, but we do now. When I was little, you could go to the airport. In fact, this is what a lot of people did, especially with little kids. You went on a Sunday afternoon to the airport to watch the airplanes take off and land. Okay, but you could actually go up into the airport and you could get close to the windows and watch the planes. Okay, increased security at ports and airports. All right, we are still dealing with that today. And then probably the most controversial is the privacy rights, okay? What we know as the Patriot Act, all right? The Patriot Act was supposed to give the government greater power to monitor things like email usage and things like that. Of course, it is controversial because people think it is a violation of their privacy rights, okay? I understand the argument, but I would counter argue that in the long run, if we prevent another attack, like September 11th. And of course, I've got really nothing in my email that I would be ashamed of the government seeing, but that's just me. Okay. I understand the argument against them, but I think the greater good outweighs my fear of invasion of privacy. That if we can prevent another attack like that, giving the government power in that situation is not a bad thing. Okay. Now, if the government starts to abuse it, that's another discussion. Okay. And again, that's just my opinion. I'm not saying you have to believe that, but that is my opinion. Okay. All right. So that's extreme terrorism here. Just a little review on September 11th. After you view this and after you take the notes on this, your homework assignment with this is to answer two questions. Number one, is remembering September 11th important? And number two, how did September 11th change the United States? Okay. I want you to be honest with both of those questions. I realize that I am dealing with kids now that do not know a world before September 11th and the changes that were brought before September 11th. So if you can't Tell me what has changed since then. That's fine. Just be honest with me and tell me that. Tell me what you've heard. Okay, you can talk about some of the things we talked about just now. If you don't think remembering September 11th is important, that is fine. Okay, I'm not going to judge you based on that, but explain to me why. Okay, explain to me why you don't think it's important. All right, so take a few minutes, answer those questions, submit those to me, and that's your little assignment attached to this lesson.